So a little bit about myself. I've worked as a waitress, a factory worker in electronics, pharmaceutical, steel, and auto. I was an electrician at an oil refinery, and then an electrician in construction. I've been a filmmaker, and now I'm a professor at Cal State Dominguez Hills. So if you would take a moment to say what kind of work you do, what union or organization you're part of, or what brings you here today. And then I'll get a chance to look at some of those, and I'll save the chat too, so we can have a chance to, I can look at it later and I can share it with you as well. So let's see.
So Vivian, did you want to go through and one by one have people introduce themselves, do short introductions?
I think I'd like to just have people write it in the chat, if that's okay. We only have an hour, so I think there's quite a few people on the call.
Yeah, we've got about, looks like 29, and so I see the chat filling up.
All right. Okay. Yeah, that's a picture of me in the trenches back in the 80s, I'd say. So at some point, if you do wish to introduce yourself in the chat, that'd be terrific. Okay. So I felt that I couldn't talk about climate justice without at first starting with COVID-19, how it's affecting us. I've been working at home. I've been warned that there could be lower student enrollment and layoffs this semester to come. People are feeling, a lot of people have already had the impact on them, lost their jobs, or are also working from home, or working in a condition which may or may not feel safe. I chose this picture of practicing social distancing on a construction job site, because usually it doesn't look like people are so interspersed this way. I want to note that Congress, many of you know that they're considering the fourth stimulus package, and it contains $1 trillion for state funding, which could help California and other states. We've heard a threat to veto this as well. And our governor has talked about a 10% cut for more than 233,000 state workers. So what I want to ask you is, do you presently go to a workplace or work from home, or go to people's homes? Are you a handy person? I see someone wrote that. A caregiver, or are you unemployed? Share your situation with us in the chat. And I'm going to look.
First responder at the front lines.
Okay. So does that mean you're at the workplace now? I can tell that's Adriana. Okay. All right. Well, I'll thank you, and keep filling those in if you so choose. So what can we learn about climate change from COVID-19? And I've quoted a couple of things from the WHO website. COVID-19 pandemic is an international public health emergency, while climate change is gradually increasing stress that may be the defining public health threat of the 21st century. We don't know, something could be worse than this. But almost all recent pandemics originate in wildlife, and there's evidence that increasing human pressure on the natural environment may drive disease emergence even further. So there is a relationship between droughts and the intervention in the Amazon, and the squeezing of wildlife, and the human-animal interface. So COVID-19 starkly reveals the inadequacy of our healthcare system, the inequality that drives life outcomes. The politics of COVID are starving the state and local budgets and making us vulnerable to disasters and further impoverishment. So we have to have a plan, a a recovery plan from the health crisis and the job shutdowns. So in the chat, if you would share what bill or campaign you are working on, if any. I noticed from the registration, there's quite a few people from different unions, staff, and members. There's people from different environmental organizations, community organizations. So if you're working on any campaigns, please share this with us. Again, it's something we can learn from each other. Let's take a moment to rent strike, Healthy LA Coalition, Reclaiming Sick Time, Schools and Community First Ballot Initiative, great. Okay, thank you. The HEROES Act. So I see y'all are busy. That's important. Some people say they're bored sitting at home. I don't understand. Okay, and then just a note, have you followed the strikes going on during the virus outbreak? And the latest you might have noticed is sanitation workers in New Orleans who are making $10 or less. And they went on strike, and after 4 days, they were replaced by prison labor, making a third of that. So I've put the, this is Portside article. No, great. At any rate, if you look at strike sanitation workers in New Orleans, you'll find the that information. So what might a COVID recovery look like, and can this recovery lead us to a greener economy? And I just thought I would put down a sketch of the future and, asking you what's important to you. So for immediate policies, I've written down a few things in terms of the economic stimulus bill so that everyone can pay rent and mortgage and bills, respect for scientists and directives, enforcing OSHA guidelines, enforcing CDC guidelines, the Essential Workers Bill of Rights right here, which is in this fourth stimulus bill, the HEROES Act, and then reinstatement of federal monitoring and reporting requirements on fossil fuels and reinstate car emission rules. So these were let go under the COVID crisis, which doesn't make much sense, but making sense doesn't always seem what is even possible these days. Longer range goals: create good jobs and meaningful work, more resistant to crisis, respect all workers' rights, right to organize, right to safety, racial and gender justice, right to sustainable wages, universal health care, tax the corporations to pay for the public goods such as education, public services, transportation. It's good to think ahead and think of what our longer range goals are. So in terms of the green economy, invest in renewable energy research and implementation, mitigation of environmental degradation that exists beyond climate change, and support a Green New Deal, rebuild society to respect the planet and everything on it. So I want to ask you, do you feel secure in your job? Do you feel safe? Do you feel like your job's going to be around? Are you going to be able to support yourself? What would make you feel safer? So let's take a moment for people to write in the chat about that. Great. Thanks, Josh. Guaranteed paid sick leave. I'm uncertain too, Aubrey. But there are things that we want to organize around for sure. Medicare for all. Okay, thank you. I'm trying to figure out the possibilities of Zoom so that we can have a conversation now about climate justice. So this presentation is about workers and climate justice. So on the one hand, climate change, this is a quote, can be seen in the form of rising sea levels, ocean acidification, melting glaciers, severe and regular heat waves, floods, hurricanes, droughts, extreme weather. The impacts of climate change are happening faster and faster, and health is being compromised. Now, what is climate justice? Climate justice, and this is from the Peer Institute at USC. We're going to be looking more at a publication by Mijin Cha and several other people from Peer. Their definition is that it acknowledges the past historic burdens placed on communities of color and low-income communities, develops strong coalitions and community voice for shared decision-making in the present, and ensures future-oriented policies reduce rather than enhance inequity. So I know that not everybody who just involved in climate change is really been integrated into climate justice, but it's an important concept, and I'm really glad that we're using that terminology today, because it does bridge the environmental degradation and the racism that's and classism that's been endemic in our society and has caused suffering among low-income and poor communities. So this, and then in terms of the global south as well. So this is not just a US-based issue. Obviously, it's a global one. And this chart from the Global Justice Ecology gives us a picture of what's causing carbon pollution, and they're singling out energy, the energy industry, because it is the largest contributor, single contributor to climate change, as well as land use change. And then this hourglass is a one that you may have seen before, where 10% of the people on Earth are producing 49% of the emissions, and 50% of the world's population is creating only 10% of the emissions. So that really, is emblematic of what climate justice is. That the majority of people in the world are paying, are suffering, are dealing with the pollution that's put out by the top 10% of the world. And this next slide, people say, well, China puts out the most emissions in the world. This is from the UN emission gap report from last year. However, the United States is the highest per capita emitter. A little repetitive there. So you can see China has a great deal more, let's say perhaps twice as much in terms of emissions as of last year than the United States, but the United States still per capita exceeds Russia, Japan, all of these countries. And it does look like it's going down a bit, but we don't know what's going to be happening. So I wonder, what do you think of when you see that the US is so much bigger a consumer and a polluter than the rest of the world? Maybe we can just stop and talk about that for a moment. Is that common knowledge, do you think? Do you think people in our communities are aware of this and our workplaces? Are people muted, or if you want to unmute yourself, you can.
Yeah, anyone who wishes to speak, feel free. If there's a good breaking point, go ahead and unmute. Or if you feel more comfortable, you can go ahead and raise your hand, and I can call on you.
Or you can put something in the chat if you like. Well, let's move on. We wanted to, oh, did you want to say something, Adriana? Go ahead.
I just wanted to say that, just an observation, that right now we haven't been very good about planning for something that we're undergoing right now as far as the pandemic, but I feel that China is the highest polluter. They're the highest exporter, and they're not regulated as well as they could be, because, you know, we are the purchaser and they have the goods that we purchase. So are we part of the problem, not the solution? Because it's about industry and such.
Good point. It's not that China is just polluting for the sake of polluting. It's they're creating goods that Europe and the United States purchase, and a lot of times invest in manufacturing in China as well. So good point. And you know that, as many developing countries point out, you know, the United States and Europe have been polluting a lot longer. It's only been recently that China and India have been able to pollute because they've industrialized. But I think this notion that, you know, per capita we have such an enormous role than any other country, I think is really critical. Okay, I'm going to move on to talking about labor and sharing some thoughts here. So what is the role of the labor movement, and how does it relate to climate justice? And, you know, for unions, a lot of times we talk about there's a line in the sand, and, you know, who are you, which side are you on? Are you on the side of the working class? Are you on the side of the corporations? When it comes to standing together, do you stand with workers and try to achieve justice for the class? The traditional role of unions is to organize and mobilize workers to bring in members, to protect the health and safety of the members and the terms and conditions of their jobs. And I know, you know, being in the leadership of my union and my chapter, that's a heavy duty. That's really time consuming. That's a huge responsibility. But beyond that, what is the role of the labor movement in relation to climate justice? So for some unions, there's a question of defending members' jobs at any cost without any other concern. If you're in construction, it doesn't matter what you build. If you build a prison, if you build, you know, a mansion, it's, you know, you're putting money in your pocket. For, you know, for some folks, that even if it's a matter of survival, like in the longshore industry, they won't unload a ship if it's being boycotted. So, you know, there are times when labor unions traditionally have also thought about other concerns. And health, safety, and justice have been part of many unions. If we go back in history, the International Workers of the World, the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, was built on looking at health, safety, and justice, thinking that the environment is part of labor. And these unions forged the link between climate justice and workers' rights. So who will fight for a just transition so that workers and communities are respected and have what they need across race, gender, and nation? Will unions fill that role? And that's what I want to talk to you about today. what unions are involved in doing that. So there are active and deep divisions among labor unions on the meaning of climate change. I've got a number of photographs here on the left. There are quite a few unions that have been demonstrating with the community in New South Wales and in a place near Liverpool, Blackpool, against fracking. And that has not really taken off. In fact, fracking pretty much stopped in the UK, even though the government and the employers were pushing it. There were a lot of demonstrations, and there was a labor community alliance. However, this insert here is about the GMB union, which is more of the gas workers. They were hoping that fracking would develop, and they were siding with the police for cracking down on anti-fracking protesters where there was a shale gas development. So there were some bitter struggles in the UK around the fracking issues. Here, this is a few years ago, as you remember, Standing Rock and the pipelines. On the one hand, there was CWA, labor solidarity with Indigenous sovereignty, standing with Standing Rock. And on the other hand, there was LIUNA, the laborers, who felt that halting the work threatened the jobs of LIUNA members who rely on these to support their families. So this is the kind of division that we see, the kind of fragmentation. So I wondered, how important is COVID-19 to your coworkers? I guess pretty important. How important is climate change? So I think that that's an interesting thing to ponder. I know even, talking to my union, the California Faculty Association, there are pockets of people who really care, but it's not a huge concern. On the other hand, I think refinery workers and fossil fuel workers are very concerned about climate change and feeling threatened about their jobs. So I'm not going to go through this slide, but this is a categorization of union positions on climate justice for unions in the US and Europe. It has to do with accepting the climate change goals, opposing the climate change goals, ambivalence on the climate change goals, and even demanding public ownership of energy companies to create more climate justice. So again, a question would be, where does your union fit in? Maybe we'll come back to that. Does your union take a position? Would you call it a union that accepts binding global climate change goals or opposes them, or isn't taking a stand?
Yeah, I think there are some really interesting comments that's
Good.
been making in the chat. Like
Thank
Carlos
you.
just shared that he was surprised to see the current president of LAOC Building Trades expressing deep concern about the Green New Deal, which, it's very concerning that leaders of our unions are taking such stances. And I think, we see that in other areas too. So I thought that was a really good point to share.
I'm just going back and I'm noticing Selena's comment about the paradox. I think that's a really interesting comment too, about it turns on its head that notion of what a developing nation looks like: dirty, clean, and inefficient, and the mental idea of developed nations, when here we're squandering energy and pollution, but we think of ourselves as much cleaner and not wasteful. So, Carlos, do you want to say more about this? What kind of concern was made by the?
Hi, everybody. It was more about, I think, the financial perspective. His interpretation of anything that's been put out about the Green New Deal talked about, it seemed like, getting more people to work, but at lower wages than what unions are offering. So it seemed like his stance was more, why are we going to get people working alongside us in the trades at lower wages, which will then depress current union wages? I think that was my interpretation of what he wrote in that newsletter.
Thank you. Well, as far as, making sure that people get paid right, that's another question. I mean, you can push for enforcement, you can push for standards, uniformity. I know among the electricians, and maybe somebody can correct me if I'm wrong here, the installation of solar panels is sometimes done by material handlers. And that's an age-old way, or certainly apprentices, with some journey folks participating as well. But that's an age-old way that contractors try to save money. But, pushing for standards, that's what we need to do. It doesn't mean that you don't create better, energy basis for the country. They're not mutually exclusive. Thank you for that, Carlos. So I'm looking at the range of union actions in several countries towards climate change, and I think this is one of the slides I'm hoping that catches your interest. So, I was talking to people all over Europe about this, and I had the opportunity to teach and lecture in England and go to Germany and the Netherlands and Denmark and Norway and speak to people in France. So I spent the most time in the UK, and I found out that they have a more of a vigorous climate change focus. And many of the unions are really involved in it. So they've developed the concept of 1 million climate jobs and are pushing for public funding for those jobs. They fight against energy poverty to make sure that everybody can afford to have electricity and clean water. Some of them oppose key fossil fuel development, fracking, advocating for the end of oil drilling or coal mining, coal-fired plants, coal terminals, and you saw the picture of people in Lancashire. And then they also are interested in raising awareness of members on environmental issues. They advocate for stronger health and safety in the workplace and in the community. They build and support environmental rep systems. So they, in addition to having stewards, they actually have a green rep who can do a number of different things. And if you're interested, I can talk more about that. They work on climate change language, contract language, so that workers and community can benefit from a smaller climate footprint. So if you can save the employer money, or if you create contract language that protects, say, workers' wages, those are important improvements that people can make within the union environment. Research and education, and of course conferences with members, affiliates, broader set of allies. Plus pushing for a just transition. So actively seeking a pathway for workers and communities to move away from fossil fuels and other climate compromising issues. And what does that look like, pushing for just transition? So it might mean that pushing for the Labor Party or one of the other parties to make sure that there's a program in place. And I'll be giving you some different examples of this. If people do lose work, or if there's a shutdown of an industry, that there's a place for people to go. More on mobilizing and informing workers. Health and safety reps, in addition to environmental reps, raise awareness. So they also emphasize and fight against air, water, and soil pollution as a trade union issue. I went to a really interesting presentation where the most conservative unions, the gas boilers, the GMB, we're working with the most progressive unions around air pollution in cities and really bringing it to their members that this is something that shortens lives, that affects children, that, you know, and they worked with an organization called Hazards. And Hazards is it's a magazine, but it's also an educational arm that sits on apprenticeship boards, on union councils to help people think about health and safety. And they write articles and do educationals. Then in Denmark, this is just an example of, again, what unions can do. Siemens had been ordered to pay a compensation of almost 1 million Danish crowns to 3 people who fell ill after working at a wind turbine factory. The Danish labor union 3F, which represents the workers in court, welcomed the ruling. The court has confirmed that it's the responsibility of the employer to ensure a healthy working environment. You know, and even windmills can be a health hazard. So I'm going to turn now to the question of a just transition. This is a word that sometimes makes people's skin crawl. I know that people have said that there is no such thing as a just transition. There's, you know, been imperfect transitions, but I think it's important to take a look at what is meant by it, what different authors and scholars and unions have to say about it. So this is a report done by, I mentioned this before, Minjin Cha with Manuel Pastor and some other scholars. And it's called A Roadmap to an Equitable Low Carbon Future, 4 Pillars for Just Transition. And their 4 pillars are strong governmental support. That is, the government has to get involved and provide financial and oversight and financial incentives and funding. Dedicated funding streams, making sure that they're not going to disappear. Diverse and strong coalitions, and economic diversification. So it sounds kind of bland, but it is boiling down a lot of really important issues that come up with a just transition. I'm going to look at the key elements according to Minjin Cha here. When she talks about strong governmental support, she's looking at short-term and long-term policies that provide immediate support to communities and workers negatively impacted by plant and mine closures, and that long-term restructure the economies and transform, you know, and mitigate former fossil fuel sites so they become places that people can live healthily. And the example is going to be the Ruhr region in Germany for this one. Dedicated funding streams, wage replacement or lost tax revenue when a plant shuts down, investing in long-term needs like seeding new business and funding long-term training and retraining programs. And this is the case study that was provided in this report is the Mojave Station and Black Mesa coal mine shut down. Strong, diverse coalitions, and this is only included as long-term, but there are short-term coalitions that, let's say, start and then maybe develop into long-term coalitions. So we'll look at it that way. There are diverse interests, workers and community, often communities of color or fence line communities, low-income communities, immigrant communities, indigenous communities who can partner with a union to fight for a just transition. And the example here is the Diablo Canyon plant closing. And I'd also say that the fire in the Chevron plant up in Richmond was a good example of a coalition effort between community, environmentalists, and labor folks. especially the steel workers. And then economic diversification, creating a vision for the economy that reimagines local economies free of fossil fuel infrastructure, moving in that direction, and community visioning with a focus on moving away from reliance on a single industry. And there are two examples here. So, if you're interested in any of these examples, looking at it more closely, you can take a look at this report. You can Google it. I'm just going to go ahead and show you. This is the Diablo Canyon one. Here's a book written by Eduardo Morena, Dunja Kraus, and Dimitris Davis that also looks at international views on just transition, looking at the global north and south. Here's the table of contents. Includes South Africa. There's an article about Jackson, Mississippi, and Australia, and a number of other countries. So
big ups to Jackson.
Yeah, that's it. Good to see. Do you know this article, Josh? Have you heard of it? Let's see. It's by Kaylee Akuno.
Yeah, by Kali.
Kali.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm familiar. I hope to incorporate Kali on some of the just transition listening project work that we're engaged in, Vivian, as it builds out.
Okay, great. So again, if you're interested in this is another book that you might want to take a look at. Got a copy right here. So one of the centers of the storm is a transition from coal. We're not free from coal. Coal is still probably the biggest fossil fuel in the world. And here's just examples from different countries. This is the union in the Netherlands, FNV, who's dealing with coal terminals in Amsterdam and some of the other ports. LO, Norway, this is Bergen, and some of their ports are also dealing with coal. Unite the Union, Britain, this is the good old United States. Germany, Lausitz, and the Eastern Europe with Eastern Germany with brown lignite coal, and then South Africa, where the mines provided a decent housing and wages for tens of thousands of people. And as they're being dismantled, solar does not provide the same thing. So what are the ways that there's going to be a just transition in South Africa? Another important question, and for South Africa, they really are talking about, socially owning energy so that it belongs to the people and not to the private corporations. Background of climate and the labor movement. Again, it's extremely interesting. I'm just going to touch on this. The Energiewende started in the 1960s, and it started, people, it was almost a hippie movement, but farmers, everybody really got into that, and they were against nuclear. IG Metall, which represents nuclear power workers, was opposed to it at first, but then joined the movement. So how IG Metall helped their members transition is an important story. And of course, the concern about good quality union jobs. And this is the example that Michin talked about, the German Ruhr Valley coal mines. And it's very interesting that labor has a stronger voice in policymaking in Germany than most other countries, having won legal and political standing to have a seat at the table. They have the tripartite system where workers are involved in governmental decisions. They also have workers' councils, and trade unions were strongly involved because of their role in society in shaping the social transition away from coal. And the German Ruhr Valley was black coal, the hard coal. And the last mine was closed in 2018, but this transition was done very slowly with a lot of investments, a lot of different employment opportunities that were our tech and knowledge industries moved into the RUR, as well as some other industries. Again, an imperfect transition, but it really was a much more concerted effort from labor unions together with government and employers. This is a more recent photo here in southeastern Germany. They have the brown coal, the strip mining, and they're still worried about losing their jobs there. So that's a ongoing transition that's being discussed in Germany. Here's the Netherlands, their coal transition. Again, that's kind of similar to Germany. They took 25 years and they broke it down. And, you know, just like with Washington, the initiative there, where they tried to look at bridging to pension, looking at external employment and you know, planning for a transition. That's the kind of thing that they were trying to accomplish in the Netherlands. Here's the Danish energy transition from coal to wind, which was relatively successful. Denmark doesn't use that much coal. They build windmills there, and the unions are very powerful. You can see that more than 2/3 of their workers are union members, and every third person in Denmark is a union member, very different from here. Similarly, they are on the board of directors. So again, this opens up our ideas. I know Bernie was talking about something like this, and Elizabeth Warren, you know, workers having a say within corporations, within the government, something more organized and respected. So here's a statement on just transition by a Danish labor leader. Transition to more environmentally sustainable society requires education, investment, renovation, building and factories, short jobs and workers. Everyone's responsible. The future will come no matter what we do. A sustainable society takes effort. So I wanted to ask you, is oil the new coal? Has the oil industry become more tenuous just in the wake of COVID? You know, I mean, there was the feud between Saudi Arabia, the oil glut, and Russia. But together with COVID, there's just been a drop in all of the demand. And, you know, that's caused a plummeting of the price of oil stocks. And here, this is an interesting CNN article said, the world may never recover its thirst for oil. That's from CNN Business in London. The world is learning to live with less oil. It may never look back. You know, we don't know what we're going to look like when we get out of this health crisis, but we can see oil futures have crashed. At the same time, our government has allowed the oil companies to take advantage of the US coronavirus aid. And this is, you know, pittance, 113 million in government-backed loans meant for small business have gone to the fossil fuel industry. I'm sure there's more things like that, but there's also been a settlement between Saudi Arabia and Russia that might have some effect. So I'm coming to an end here. I just wanted to, you know, point out that building coalitions across unions, countries, and with environmental groups for just transition has been going on in the United States, in the UK, internationally. There's trade unions for energy democracy, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth. But there needs to be more of a dialogue because environmental, indigenous groups, communities of color, and labor groups often see things differently. And unless we sit at the same table, unless we work together, we won't understand each other. We won't know how to fight together. We won't know how to win together. So what can young workers do to have a voice in the transitions to come? I've put a few ideas here. Follow the news, question your sources, bring up concerns about climate change and climate justice with coworkers, form a climate justice committee in your union, see if there's space for having an environmental rep in your local, study where there might be contract language for climate actions, find out how communities are affected by the work you do, meet with climate justice advocates and learn about their work. I know there's a few people on the call from climate justice groups. Look at models in different countries, especially where there are strong unions. Check out Denmark Flexicurity. It's another interesting concept, German workers' councils, and learn about efforts internationally to create equitable and sustainable societies. So here's Trade Unions for Energy Democracy and some climate justice groups. And finally, use art and culture to promote expression. These are two posters, one about the port and one about oil, thinking about how workers and community are raising the questions about the future. So we have a few minutes. Let me see if folks want to respond to or ask questions or bring anything up. I see that there's things in the chat box I haven't seen.
I had a quick question for anyone in this group too. If your unions or other kind of community organizations are active in this area, what does that look like? Because I know I'd be very interested to learn about any steps that I could take to get my own union more involved. Because this is not really an issue that's brought up within my local or on our international level. So I'm just curious if anyone else has any unions that are active on climate justice, even if it's not the union per se, but if it's your members, and kind of what that looks like on your end.
I'm just noting that people have some really interesting things to say in the chat, and there's some questions there too, like about unionizing solar workers. But to your point, Linda, let's see, would anybody want to respond to what Linda says? If you're in the musicians local, right? Why should musicians care about climate justice? And I could make some comments, but there's a lot of people here who know a lot more than I do.
So it sounds like IA has a green committee that's just starting up, which is great. And Nicole, I would love to just chat with you a little bit more, even just what that looks like, because you got to start somewhere, right? Because I'm definitely looking to get my members active about this. So I'd love to chat with you offline about that.
This is Charlie with USW.
Hi, Charlie.
Hi.
Sorry.
And I guess so we have a next gen committee where we're pretty much trying to address climate change because obviously we're refinery workers and a lot of people want to shut us down. So we're starting to have conversations with our membership about climate change because there's two different there's two different issues, right? One, we're facing climate change proposals, and then two, a lot of the people that are in charge of our unions as far as leadership, they're going to retire pretty soon, so they're not really putting too much emphasis or importance on climate change. So what we're starting to do is trying to educate our members at my level to let them know that, hey, climate change is real, and we can probably start negotiating something with these companies every time we negotiate something, as far as maybe an additional pension, a savings plan, or something. So I think it's been about 2 years that we've been talking about climate change, and it's been a very, very, very slow process with us. A lot of our members don't believe in it. So it's been a challenge for me, and I think Vivian's kind of witnessed this. We're trying to get the word out. We're trying to get people to get engaged in the conversation, but it's just really, really hard for us.
I think, being in the industry, people feel threatened, and it's hard to talk about something that's so threatening. I know your members are pretty knowledgeable about the hazards that they deal with on a daily basis as well. So, you know, that I think that the bridge between health and safety and people's workplace environment, as well as the community, that's one of the important, I think, ways to get people opening up and talking. And then, you know, being threatened with job loss, I think it's looking at what industries can the steelworkers get into that will be a pathway for the workers. I know that that's another thing that your leadership is doing and that you've been involved in is, you know, what are the jobs? You know, somebody brought up, why don't we organize solar workers? And I think that's a really good question. There are, you know, the IBEW does install solar, but mainly in large solar farms, not in rooftop, right? And the solar farms are actually hazardous to a lot of, you know, to animal life and, you know, indigenous folks that don't want encroachment on their land. So there is a contradiction there. And, you know, these are not easy topics to figure out. I'd like to just say something quickly to Linda, and maybe other people want to join in. You know, it may be obscure or like far-fetched to think about this, but look, I mean, one of the things that COVID, I think, has taught us is that our society, we depend on each other. How can you have, we can't have live concerts now. And so, you know, and what kind of budget are people going to have for culture and art? You know, just one, you know, thinking about public sector money is going to be fought over. And the money that goes to the arts, the money that goes to music, that goes to, you know, live concerts and free concerts, it's going to be, you know, there's going to be a lot more competition for that money. So the climate change and climate justice has ramifications on our daily lives when we think of ourselves as part of a society that, you know, kind of lives and dies together. And this, I think COVID has really brought that home in ways that were harder to figure out before. You know, again, like my situation, that the professors at Cal State Dominguez Hills are not that, you know, unless they're in the environmental field, they're not that interested, or they're not concerned about the climate. But now, you know, we're going to be unprepared. First responders, you know, fire departments, and you know, all kinds of public agencies are going to be hard pressed. So no matter if you're a musician or a teacher or an electrician, you know, we're going to be hurt by COVID-19 and by climate change. We're left unprepared and vulnerable. Is there anybody else who'd like to raise a comment, a question? Selena?
I just, like in response, Linda, to your how do we start talking about this conversation, and like kind of piggybacking off of what Charlie had mentioned. I know at our local 11 electricians, Los Angeles State, one time right before a union meeting, there was a guy who was invited to hand out petitions and have signatures signed by all the local members, right, about not allowing some regulation with regards to the refineries. And so like I feel like within local 11 and people who are working at the refineries, one of the things we have to fight is like this disinformation. Neighborhood groups and community members had wanted a transition from one chemical in one of the many things at the refinery in their area to transition to this other one. But this guy was standing there and he was like, they're trying to shut down your job. They're trying to take away everything you've worked for, and you're not going to have any work there anymore. And they're just going to replace them with unskilled labor if you don't sign this. And then everyone's like, okay, putting their name on it. And so I took it and I read it and I was like, well, it says they want to move from this chemical to this chemical, which might be more expensive, more limited, more something, right? But some of us like are fighting disinformation to begin with, that our unions are backing. So it's important about all these things to kind of read all the information. And I know when I was standing that union meeting, I was like, oh, well, I'm not signing this. And everyone's like, oh, well, why? And then I had to like kind of explain. So that's also something that's happening. Sometimes the unions are backing, just trying to keep a job and allowing fear mongers to be present. And that's a problem.
Yeah, I think that's a huge point too, that we need to kind of have a game plan for how to combat, if our unions are taking a very public, anti-climate stance, what we can do as members, or, whether or not you work at the union like I do, or you're a union member, what we can do to kind of combat that narrative within that. Like it's a very difficult thing to navigate, but we've got to make a place. And I think it's true, being able to plug in people to these various, organizations that already exist and these coalitions. And I think that's a really important thing. We need to have a clear line of communication with these groups where we can funnel members into, if they're feeling, that their own union isn't a place for that. Because to be, honestly, that's just going to be the hard truth for a lot of people. So we have to find a way to get them plugged in other areas. So that's a great point. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I think the next gen groups and the young workers groups are a great place to, have that conversation if it's harder to have it in your own union.
Yeah.
Moises?
Yeah. Oh, well, the chemical you're talking about was MHF at the Torrance Refinery, but that's a different conversation another day. Our local, my boss, Vivian, Dave Campbell, he's been very involved in speaking on just transition for the last 25 plus years. So I've just been mentored on that, and getting close to working with him on the last 2 years on this. One of our members, he was on, I don't know if he's still on, Danny and I went to Washington State to work on Initiative 1631, the one that you were talking about, just to work on that initiative and get the yes vote, just because we saw how that was an important initiative where these companies, these carbon polluters, were going to get credited, and through those credits, they were going to raise money towards transition for people that are 55 and closer to retirement. They would just get paid out and they don't have to do new trainings. There will be education funds towards the communities that are at risk and within the areas of those chemical polluters. And we just saw the importance, and we saw that if something like that happened here, that would be big for the state of California, and possibly big just for our members, because we represent over 2,600 oil members, whether they're refinery workers or transportation logistics sites. And we as a local, we see the need where California has their Green New Deal that they want to do. LA County has their sustainability plan where they want to be carbon neutral by 2050. And the mayor has his own plan. But a big issue was, our members, our oil workers, were never at the table. So the important thing is you're either at the seat of the table or you're on the table. And in this instance, we're on it. So we as a local, we're getting involved through LNS, big help, big champion, and we're a part of them. And we were able to go to a meeting with the mayor's office with LNS to speak on the final stages of that plan. But the local, we just organized Proterra, the electric bus manufacturer, and we're hopeful to get an apprenticeship program there with a joint labor management trust language that we can expand to different companies. And maybe one day we can pressure oil to go into that and create their own fund to build that fund. And when the time comes to transition to different sectors, geothermal, desalination, biotech, all these different clean industries, we have those funds right there where we can train our members and they can have that training fund and transition to those clean industries instead of like what happened to our members at Exide. They got shut down, no transition, they're left out in the streets. And they were good family sustaining jobs, but there was no transition. It was a dirty battery recycling plant, but there was no transition plan for them. So our local, we're very big on, working with the environmental movement, but also having a plan for our members to transition to new industries without them getting left on the table.
Well said. Yeah, thank you so much for that. It's a matter of life and death. I mean, it's a matter of bread and butter. It's harder, a little bit harder to see when you're not directly impacted. But on the other hand, we all live in communities, right? So we all are affected by whether it's refineries, danger or pollution, or whether it's, the extreme weather. We're all affected by the issues of climate. And if you're, if you're in a fence line community, of course, it's more intense. So that's another kind of aspect. If the labor union is also a place where people kind of have their concerns about their community, and labor has a role to play. In this country, it's been so limited, it's been so attacked, and it's been herded into a corner just to fight for wages and benefits. And what I was trying to present to you today is to show you that, there are unions that fight for a lot more, and the U.S. Steelworkers is one of them, member of the, Blue and Green Alliance. But, there are unions that really have environmental reps within their union, and even look at an audit of their workplace. What are we doing? Are we wasting lights here? Can we save money? Just a simple audit of your own utilities in your union hall or your workplace. It's worthwhile, and it gets people thinking.
Yeah,
So
these are all really great points, and I want to thank you again. I know we're going over on time, and I want to thank you so much and everyone for being here. So I don't know if anyone has any final thoughts or questions or anything that they want to share before we wrap.
Well, I want to underline, that the material in the chat is so rich. Can you save it, Linda? Because I don't think I have
Yes,
the ability to save
it's
that.
automatically saved, and I'll be sending out a follow-up email, if not tonight, tomorrow, but within 24 hours with the information in the chat. And if you're able to share your presentation, we would love to include that as well.
Okay, and if I can see that a lot of people have posted events that are coming up. The Labor Network for Sustainability is doing a webinar next Wednesday, or on the May 27th. It's not next week, but there are other people who've put in information about their unions. So here's an AFL-CIO letter on green initiatives. This is a wealth of resources. So If you have anything else to add to the chat, please do that now.
Yeah, please do. We would love that. I'd love to include that in a follow-up to all the attendees here. And I'm also going to be sharing this information through the LA Young Workers email list and social media, all that good stuff too.
Thanks. Thanks for this opportunity. It's, really great to see everybody, and I really appreciated the responses and questions. So, yay, LAYW.
Thank you so much, Vivian. Again, it was a wonderful presentation, and thank you all for participating and having such a great dialogue. I think this is such an important conversation to keep having. So I hope this can be an ongoing conversation with us, and definitely, figuring out ways to strengthen and grow partnerships is absolutely essential. So yeah, thank you guys so much.
All right.
And it's good to see your faces. I miss you all.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.